You know that Simpsons joke where Bart says, "This is the worst day of my life," and Homer says, "This is the worst day of your life so far"? That's how it's felt being a transatlanticist recently. Each day brings a fresh verbal assault from the Trump administration. As if things weren't bad enough before last week's episode with Kia Giles, we've had the grotesque Oval Office episode, and today, JD Vance's dismissal of Britain and France and her war dead. Underlying these attacks is a belief that Britain and Europe should no longer be dependent on American protection. And with some urgency, British and European officials agree. In order to do that, though, they'll need to disentangle themselves from dependence on American tech. This is why I really wanted to talk to today's guest. Katja Bego is a senior research fellow at Chatham House who specialises in the geopolitics of big tech. On the show today, we discuss the importance of building a quote-unquote Eurostack, why spending on defence is no longer taboo for Europeans, and why Trump and Putin might regret empowering the EU. We also touch on why AI is a bubble waiting to burst, her Italian husband's favourite swear word, if Russia really is conducting a sabotage campaign across Europe right now, and I also managed to crowbar in Fraser again. I hope you enjoy our talk. Katja, thank you very much for sparing the time today.
Very happy to join.
I'm going to start with my usual Inside the Actors Studio questionnaire. What is your favourite word?
My favourite word? That's a good one. Petrichor, perhaps, if you've heard of it. So it's the sort of the smell that kind of the smell of kind of like the streets, etc. after it's rained, or the kind of the smell of like rocks and stone after it's rained.
Nice. What is your least favourite word?
Least favourite word? Oof. Not sure that I have one. Maybe, like management speak, perhaps. Like circling back, one of those, perhaps.
What is your favourite curse word?
Favorite curse word? I do have a good one. So my husband's Italian, so he'll say this a lot when we're watching football. So there's porca troia. Is an Italian term, and it means basically pig from Troy. A bit ruder than that, the implication, but I think it's a slightly more poetic swearing, I think.
Have you used it much over the last several weeks?
Well, yeah, I probably should do. I mean, it's even worse than that, even less poetic than that.
What is a sound or noise that you love?
Sound or noise that I love? Perhaps can I say a type of music, or kind of a music band? I think counts as sound. So my favorite band, which I think I'm obsessed by for many decades, is Depeche Mode. So that would probably be my favorite sound.
What is a sound or noise that you hate?
People watching any form of TikTok on public transport without headphones. Absolutely.
I think about this time last year, so I was on a train between Barcelona and Avignon, and it made me realize how much I love French people, because someone was listening to something on their phone and their earphones hadn't connected, and it might have only been like 10, 15 seconds, something like that, but immediately a French person in the carriage told them their earphones aren't connected, and it was a British person. They were very apologetic and everything like that, and I sort of thought, if that was Britain, people would have sat in silence, furious for the whole train journey.
It is true. Kind of like angry side eyes, so angry escalation.
Do you have any guilty pleasures?
Maybe, I don't know if this quite counts as quite a very bad guilty pleasure, but maybe pulpy spy novels. So I think like the bad ones with like the big like red, like like the grey and red covers.
What is your favorite book?
My favorite book, probably that's a very difficult question actually. maybe Life and Faith by Vasily Grossman. So this is kind of like magnus opus sort of around World War II, which I think is actually extra relevant to read today, sort of like how kind of individuals can kind of become like wrapped up, right, in these sort of large waves of moments of history. Beautiful.
And finally, is there a fictional character who you imagine yourself to be?
Ooh, not really, actually. I don't know. Come up with something clever, but I don't have one.
So last week, I interviewed Samir Puri, your colleague at Chatham House, and my first question was sort of how did he get into foreign policy and international relations? Because I've always been into it since I was like a weird kid. So I wondered, like, how did you get drawn into it?
That's a good question. So it's I think there's sort of two paths for me into this, sort of my personal interest and my professional career kind of path into this, which is a bit more winding, I guess. So I've always been very interested in international affairs history, as well, and kind of like larger kind of geopolitical questions. Even it is similar to you since I was quite little, I think, and primarily just to reading books, history books, and the like. Over time, I guess, linking back a bit maybe to the Vasily Grossman book. That's a fictional depiction, but I think in his non-fiction books don't quite give the sort of magnitude of a moment, right, in the way that fiction can. But reading these sort of things since I've been quite young, and then professionally, I did study things like this in university. So I studied political science and economics, which I think has increasingly become a slightly more interesting combination in different ways. At least as I've tried to approach it, and then studied later on history of war as well. So I think this is kind of three key elements, I say that inform my thinking about international affairs, if that makes sense. But my professional path into this came more from the technology space first, which I now work on a lot. So that's more around topics of, say, big tech power and accountability, and sort of consolidation of power in the technology sphere is something I've worked on for over a decade, and increasingly with that sort of geopolitical angle to it, which I think at this very moment, and I'm sure we might discuss a little bit later as well, are of course increasingly intertwined as well, and historically also have been, I'd say. So that's probably the main sort of path.
I mean, I do feel that political economy is becoming a more and more important thing, partly as a result of, I think maybe after the end of the Cold War, maybe interest dropped because there was essentially one political economy sort of theory. And then also, I think a lot of mainstream parties across Europe and America had just stopped thinking about political economy. And so it seems to me there's a moment right now where like new political economy theories are coming into force, but no one's actually thought about them and grapple with them, and if there should be anything new or different in its place.
It's a funny moment. I agree with you. I think that's interesting. And there's also something, I think, indeed, also after the Cold War, where you've seen this quite big bifurcation in just the communities thinking about these issues, right? As if the economic is not political, and the political, like geopolitical, has nothing to do with economics. It's a bit more nuanced than that, but I think there is, like, you just see these different, particularly sort of security communities talk about some of these issues. With, of course, huge exceptions, but that's maybe a space people have been forced to grapple with quite quickly, like these questions about economic coercion and these sort of things, and how, like the larger, like old debates basically are returning, right, like kind of into the sort of geopolitical arena, and at the same time a bit more like the economic sphere, etc. That some of that thinking around security, but even broader geopolitical questions, of course, they're not new, they've always been there, but not quite in this way that they're now. So I feel there's still quite a lot of ground in between there, where a lot of interesting thinking needs to be done and can be done, and like how power works when these two combine in the way that they are now.
So this may seem like a tangent, but have you ever seen Frasier?
Some episodes, not the full
thing.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, so there's a particular episode where Frasier has an important contract negotiation coming up, with the radio station that he works at. And he fires his sort of cynical, manipulative, but very competent agent and hires a newbie. And it's a disaster because there are like PR catastrophes. He gets attacked by a bird at a photo op. It's just generally disastrous. And his old agent tries to win him back. And, she says, your name's a punchline, your face is riddled with bird bites, and your career is 5 minutes from over. And he's only been your agent for 3 days. That's how I felt with Trump this last month. It feels like we've lived through about 5 historical epochs in like a handful of weeks. How have you felt?
There's sort of 2 versions or 3 versions of me. So the first version is just sort of as the concerned citizen, agreed. Second version of me trying to finish a book right now that tried to say something bigger about global order. So it's a book about submarine cables and so particularly communications cables and how they've kind of the role they've played throughout history as a sort of tool of weapon and sabotage issues, these sort of things, obviously in the news a lot right now. Trying to finish a book that tries to say something about the world when that world looks different every 3 days, almost feels like some sort of Greek punishment, like a Greek punishment or something, right? Like every time I'm like, okay, well, now we can settle on something here. It's something a completely different changes. So it's yes, so feeling like that as well. But even just to grapple with or try to analyze what's happening, I find it very challenging. I agree, kind of more from a professional point of view. Like we can speculate so much about what all of this means. Like you can assign like 4 or 5 or 6 dimensional chess to things that I don't think are quite that. And like just to understand this moment, I agree completely. And I think anyone who pretends to now know what's actually happening in this moment and what it all means, like I mean, by all means should talk about it and try to analyze it. But anyone who pretends to understand or kind of be a Trump stayer in this moment, I don't think should be taken too seriously, basically.
I mean, we sort of first started communicating on Blue Sky, and I hate checking it now because it just seems like constant doom scrolling, and it's like I'll go on and like the Western Alliance has collapsed. And then the next day, it's like the Western Alliance is saved because Trump said something marginally warm towards von der Leyen. And then the next day, sort of, Europe is on the verge of being overrun by the Russian army. And then the next day, it's so I check it less and less because it just depresses me.
I think that's the right approach. It's that weird feeling. It's not exactly like the period 2020, 2024, there's plenty to doom scroll about, if not even more. But it's that weird feeling that I hadn't had in a couple of years when he was back in power, right? Like waking up here in the morning in sort of European time zones, checking your phone, like, oh, what has he done now again overnight, right? Like, and everything, another 50 things to catch up with. But yeah, it's obviously part of the strategy, I think, as well, right? To overwhelm us so much and to kind of keep putting you in the wrong foot and not understanding what's going on. It's very easy to retreat from it.
I mean, when
going on Twitter right now is like, I just 20 seconds and you sort of lose faith in the world.
I mean, I left Twitter soon after Musk bought it because I thought I can't deal with that. So the last handful of weeks have seemed to have created a sort of sense of crisis among European leaders about Europe's, I guess, military and strategic autonomy in the world. You've sort of had Trump threatening tariffs on the EU. There was the Hesketh and Vance speeches at the Munich Security Conference. You had Marco Rubio's meeting with the Russians in Saudi Arabia and looking like they were sort of doing a deal over Ukraine's head. All that's kind of provoked a flurry of meetings and briefings from British and European officials about, this time they're serious about European defense. What's your view on the seriousness?
It's a hugely frustrating moment, right? Because there's been so many Cassandras warning about this for decades, really, right? This is not new. whatsoever, and everyone knew that this moment would inevitably come at some point. I mean, I will say, like, I didn't quite expect it to look like that American retreat would look like this. I think that I'll probably not be alone in that. But there's been so many warnings, so many moments that, you had headlines everywhere. Is this the moment Europe finally wakes up? And they really do. They go back decades, really, and there's no excuse, particularly after 2014 and more didn't happen. But okay, now we are where we are. You could see this moment as an opportunity, I guess. I mean, we now speak on the 20th of February. I don't know. I think next week could already look entirely different. Maybe we've had big announcements, maybe more division. Maybe Trump has changed his mind. In a way, I hope he doesn't, at least for a little while, not when it comes to Ukraine, but on some of this rhetoric, turn it around, because I think too many leaders are still trying to sort of grasp at straws, right? Trying to sort of find something positive in the mess to kind of serve as an excuse. I do think this moment changes everything, right? Like, I think there is now at least a shared recognition that money needs to be spent, that bold action needs to be taken at a political level. But I actually think is probably even the bigger change. And I mean, the statistics sort of bear this out, but this is more me observing or kind of temperature checking people, that I just feel that the sentiment among European citizens about this has even changed quite a lot, right? And that, I think, will be the key moment. You see some of these polling numbers, I think in Germany, etc., that people are quite willing to pay for this, that it's not just a nice idea to have a more integrated, independent European defense capacity, even an integrated army in due course, which I would support, but I know is still a prospect that's quite far off. But that the mood kind of among the general public has really shifted. And that, I think, will be that key moment, that it almost feels that the leaders are now behind of where the public already is. And now it's about making that tangible, making that practical. Not saying that that's going to be easy, but I think a lot of the blueprints are there. The kind of public imagination might be there. I know I shouldn't be like anecdote, does not make like a bigger fact, but these are issues that we've been on a couple of family visits and just speaking to family members who really did not care about any of this at all for a long, long time, now suddenly really do, right? And they also start to talk about, we need to integrate Europe, we need to have a shared army, and a sort of recognition as well that defense spending is not necessarily a dirty thing to do, but something actually important for our security. That momentum shift is there. I think it's very tricky on a political level, of course, to now find the levers of what that change might look like. I think they're there, but to actually execute on them.
But there was a story in the FT the other day about some more imaginative thinking about how to fund more defense spending. There was an idea about a sort of rearmament bank. It heartened me that usually the debate seems to be very stuck in a sort of either country A needs to raise more taxes or cut public spending, and as those are neither politically palatable, no more money will be spent on defense. And then the debate usually ends, especially in Britain. So it was heartening me sort of seeing officials trying to come up with bureaucratically imaginative solutions to these problems.
Yeah, I agree. And it somehow makes it tangible, makes it a bit real, right? Like, we've now moved on beyond the should we, but into the how do we do it. I agree. That's interesting. As well, that whole, like, what to me already feels quite antiquated and always has been a little bit, this kind of fiddling with numbers, is all the talk about NATO spending, like thresholds and things, like it's 2%, 2.5%, sure, that's important, but that's not really what this is about, right? Like, this is really about sort of resolving like quite key kind of capability gaps that Europe just does not have or cannot do without the US. These sort of issues is where the focus should be. And how do you get something that looks credible? It's not, I mean, it's about money, and a lot of money needs to be spent. But these sort of things as like, oh, if only like we bring it up to 3 or 4 or 5, and then we've like placated the Americans, right? Like that discussion, at least to me, feels that is, I mean, still being had, but it's a bit one of the past, right? And we've now moved into the trajectories of like, how do you really quickly get some of this to happen?
I also feel like from everything that Trump says about defense spending and how much Europeans spend on defense, I think he has it in his mind that that's what these countries pay to America.
Mm-hmm.
So for Norway to spend 2.5% on defense, and for him to not be personally enriched by whatever that figure is, he will think, well, they're going to have to spend 3.5%, 5.5%. There'll never be a number that's satisfactory to him.
I agree completely, and there's also something I think quite ironic or funny about this whole situation, to the extent you can find joy in all of this, is that inevitably, like, the Trump administration come to regret kind of what they've asked for here, right? Because there's this assumption that all the money extra that's going to be spent is going to be spent on kind of procuring American weapons. But they've undone so much goodwill and there's so much trust lost here that obviously will take a sort of buy Europe turn. Like, I think that's another one where the French will be proven right? Like that's going to be, the onus is going to be on that, or at least from, like, let's say, more trustworthy allies. Obviously, the UK will be part of that, and other countries as well, but they really set in motion a really rapid sort of decoupling, not just on the defense front, but in many areas away from US power, which are the very pillars of US power in Europe. They're kind of knocking over, so he can threaten us now. But then by European countries listening to those, or kind of heeding his warnings, like he's also basically fatally undermining US power.
I kind of touched on this with Samir, but instinctively, I'm an Atlanticist. I have a very nostalgic view of a sort of American-led, Western-centric world order. Something that's frustrated me about the Trump administration from their own view of the world. Like, if their own view is sort of the Western alliance as a protection racket, he is at the top at. When I've sort of seen various comments by Hesketh, the new defense secretary, it's like, it must be the first protection racket in history in which the gangster is encouraging their marks to arm themselves. So, like, even on its own terms, it makes no sense as a protection racket. Whereas, historically, I remember Jake Sullivan wrote an essay back in sort of 2019 about how allies accentuate American power. They're not a drag on American power. And precisely the setup that America has right now is more of the protection racket, in the sense of America can dictate to Europe on security issues because it provides that protection. But a world in which Europe is less dependent on America means America has less sway over those issues.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I've been doing some writing on this, actually. Like, if you think of the sort of beyond the, like, sort of sheer hard power, like what America's power over Europe, or sort of its wider web of allies, looked like, was really, right, as a sort of intermediary almost. So sort of, if you think of it, like these sort of dependencies, not just on the defense front, but anything from technology, etc., which always had the US as the central node. So, but there's always this sort of, America sets the sort of parameters in which everyone else could act, right? Like both kind of on this dependency fronts, but the alliances, they're always the US collecting allies, to which it's always the one sort of common denominator, and kind of sets, or used to kind of set the kind of way which everyone was happy in some ways to listen to, right? Because it kind of allowed us to outsource all of that to one place. And even now you're forcing everyone to imagine like what like either a decoupling or a de-risking, it's not even the right term for this, but something almost like emancipated from that sort of American umbrella of not just literally like weapons, etc., but just of thinking like what's possible, the realm of possibilities of how you could act as a geopolitical actor in a space, whether you're a small country or a large one. If you erode all of that's the whole basis of their global power. And I just don't think whatever happens next, like even if everything changes, like all of this was a negotiating tactic, I don't think that it is. But you can never turn the clock back on that. It feels like to me like that's dead. Whatever happens next, like maybe that doesn't necessarily suggest now that there is I think there might be, but like a very sort of geopolitically kind of well integrated, very strong Europe on the horizon. But there is no Europe on the horizon, in my view, like of the possible palette of options that's left. Something that still looks like it has looked for, say, like in the mid-90s in terms of Europe its relationship to the US, that I think we can say will never return. Yeah, but to me, it's quite surprising about all of that. Now you see some Republican rumbling around all of this, but they're the chief architects of a lot of this, right? Like it's Republican policy and they're just letting it happen. This is 80 years of very carefully constructed policy and agendas and kind of web weaving, if you will. And it's all been destroyed in a matter of weeks. And there's very little reflection of that coming out of America, which is interesting.
It was kind of brought home to me when I think it was Hesketh, his comments at Munich, where basically the vibe seemed to be America will dictate the terms of the Ukraine deal, but it will have no role in the enforcing of the deal, which to me sort of provoked the question of like, so how do you get to set the terms? Like, if Europe's going to be responsible for the enforcing of any deal, then Europe will get to say what the terms are. It kind of reminded me, have you ever read Margaret Macmillan's Paris 1919?
Yeah, I have done, yeah.
So it's one of my favorite books, and I was revisiting it, I think in like December or something, and it was striking me how similar Trump and Woodrow Wilson are. That there's a very almost messianic belief that they can bring peace to Europe, whether European leaders like it or not. But Trump is also a kind of bizarro Wilson in the sense of, Wilson believed that great power politics was the reason America was drawn into Europe's problems. Whereas Trump believes it's international institutions that are the reason why America gets drawn in and therefore it needs to return to great power politics. But I was sort of thinking how Trump has less leverage over Europe to dictate a peace settlement than Woodrow Wilson did when everyone was indebted to America. The military presence that America had in Europe is also already drastically reduced from where it was, 40 years ago. So I always feel like there's a gulf in the media between a sort of omnipotent Trump who's like flush with victory and then the actual leverage America seems to have to make stuff happen.
It's interesting. I think there's interesting moments in the 30s as well. Like a lot of this relies, right, indeed, also on the US having the kind of credibility to back up, indeed, as you say, what they say by actual deeds, which require sacrifice. And I think that's another interesting element, like, or maybe kind of parallel with the 20s, 30s as well. So I don't know if you've read the Deluge as well, the Adam Tooze on that period, and you just read that, and this is a bit of strange revisionist history, perhaps, but you just read it, and there's so many decisions there of a sort of like newly, let's say, empowered US as a geopolitical actor in a very different way, that they're quite like maybe quite immature in some of those approaches, but that they quite often in those moments also go for an America first or something else, which really sets in motion, of course, any return of the war debts, which kind of creates a lot of issues down the line later on, where maybe a different posture, a more generous posture, a strategic posture may have avoided a lot of the mess. But it's interesting to see that there is that I think is an interesting parallel as well with this current moment as well. It's like if you cannot juggle both of these agendas, right? And they very effectively for a very long time played enough of a good steward role, if you will, in a system. And if you abandon that, like that's what their power was built on. So I just wonder what that's going to look like when you lose a lot of those levers. You're just a very resource-rich, very rich country for now. But the other things are soft, right? Like, and it take a very long time to build and credibility to build. And if you don't have that leverage, I just don't see whatever they have in hard power in the US would necessarily translate into.
You've kind of touched on how, your speciality is sort of tech and big tech. And I'm sort of curious about what would Europe being serious about defense and freeing itself from America, what would that mean in terms of tech?
Yeah, that's a big area where I think a lot of people have done a lot of thinking on for a long time. And it's one of those other frustrating Cassandra moments, it feels like, if you will, similarly on the defense front, the technology front, like how absurdly dependent Europe has become on American technology. On the good side, and I can talk a bit about that. As I do think there are quite good plans in place for how you could disentangle yourself from that. And I finally think there's some momentum around that, because it tends to be difficult to warn people about hypothetical risks when it's not per se materialized yet. But now where we are. If you almost want to imagine, say, digital systems or the internet, if you will, or everything related to that as a kind of system of slices, right? Like going all the way down to sort of physical infrastructure layers, from like submarine cables to satellites, etc., and then across all these layers of the stack up to kind of applications and the devices we use. Almost everything is American, right? European governments have most of their critical information, etc., on American cloud providers. All of that is very, very vulnerable. The big questions here around, of course, Europe's competitiveness and what it means, and that's what we've often focused on what it means to outsource and kind of send all the money to Silicon Valley, to, not the most nuanced way to phrase that, but that idea. But the kind of security vulnerabilities we've created here, and the kind of ability for these large companies to weaponize that advantage, are huge. On the defense side, there's some things, and there are definitely initiatives now on a European level to try to address that. For example, space dependence on the US, also in a kind of command and control setting, etc., and ISR. These sort of capabilities, we're very, for aspects of it, quite reliant on the Americans, and for some of them completely. That will take time. Like Europe, again, has fallen behind. That has kind of sat back on its laurels. Things that you're missing critical bits and pieces. So there are the risks, but you need to have independent cloud. You need to have a European cloud alternative. You need to be building social media networks and whatever, and not maybe from the top down, but at least create the conditions in which alternatives can emerge that can challenge some of these American models, because they're being used against Europe effectively right now. There's no accountability, and I think that, and by no means per se in this sort of deregulate everything camp, but Europe has relied far too long in the technology sphere on using kind of its regulatory superpower, right, to sort of shape the parameters of what's possible. Try to kind of bend these big tech companies in a more accountable, or whatever you want to call it. Human-centric is a word that the Commission likes for that. But realistically, right, like you can shave a bit at the margins, but it doesn't give you genuine power, and it doesn't give you kind of autonomy to shape what we want this kind of digital sphere to look like.
I was reading the scholar, I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, Mariette Schack.
Yeah.
Oh, thank God.
Sorry, Dutch name I used to say, which is interesting, yeah.
And her writing about creating a Eurostack.
Right. I was very glad that she mentioned it, because it's something I've worked on for quite a long time, and it's like a group of people really thinking about that. A lot of this in various permutations. There's not one agreed vision of what that could look like, but this is basically thinking all the way from, say, the AI space, AI compute capacity, these things I mentioned, this kind of physical infrastructure investments, all the way up to the top, like how you can think about creating an alternative ecosystem here. I think a very interesting person has done a lot of thinking about this and should really be seen. Some of the kind of great unifiers on this is Christina Cafaro. She's a competition economist, very interesting thinking around this on the other side. So you can almost think of industrial policy perhaps as an antitrust mechanism, like how can you break some of these massive holds these companies already have over Europe's, really the global digital economy, through using kind of strategic funding of that allow other alternative solutions to come into being. I'd like to think of this or kind of as a catchphrase, like how do you not necessarily create a European Google, but how do you create the conditions that basically prevent the next Google and create something that's a lot more diverse, open ecosystem? That all might sound a bit idealistic, but I do think that's quite important, because we're now seeing just how much power gets concentrated in single platforms, single places. So how can you just create something that's more open, where we just as users, etc., have more of an ability to shape things? And maybe you can even bake in some of that into how these systems are designed, rather than have to rely, let's say, on the benevolence of an unaccountable CEO somewhere.
This would be a much bigger discussion, but having been involved in sort of the startup scene, I'm incredibly skeptical of AI in the sense of a world-changing product. I've seen a lot of companies that have raised lots and lots of money having discovered the next big thing and then make no profit, and then go out of business, and then VCs move on to the next big thing. You sort of had it with sort of crypto, NFTs, AI. And so it like in the whole mix, there's been all this talk of like open AI, and then sort of DeepSeek, and then sort of Europe having Mistral. What you said about sort of not creating a European Google, but creating the conditions for. It seems to me that that's more important in a sort of AI aspect than it is in building our own OpenAI or DeepSeek.
Yeah, I agree completely. And first, like, sort of on the AI front, I share your skepticism. I see a lot of this moment that we're currently witnessing in the US of these big tech companies and the AI companies cozying up to the Trump administration as basically sort of like the desperate last things. Like they all know the emperor has no clothes, right? That there is just not really a normal return on investment on this that can in any way ever recoup the absurd amounts of money that have already been invested into this. So what do? Then you can turn to the government to kind of fund the quite outlandish ambitions to buy more time or whatever. Not everyone might agree with this, but I don't think there's really been much innovation in Silicon Valley really since maybe 2015, maybe even a little bit longer. And they're out of ideas. There is a lot of money in the system. A lot of that money in the system is being wasted on absurd things, and the AI being perhaps the most tangible one. And it's where most money is this sort of last gasp of a system trying to make this work, right? It's not to say it's not an interesting technology. Like when you use it, it is remarkable, but there is just nothing there that I can see that could in any way be as profitable as they promise it to be, unless you have these sort of quite bizarre visions, right? Or just not credible visions around AGI or whatever that might mean and how everything will change. So you've basically got yourself in a cult situation. It's like we'll just keep spending more and more and more until at some point this magical moment will arrive, and then everything was moot anyway, because anything that we know from like capitalism and global order, none of it will matter anymore because we have machines.
I mean, my joke is usually like, there was money to be made in tulips, just not as much money as everyone thought. And I feel like that's the same with AI. It's like, I'm sure there is a service that it can provide that is useful. It's just, if people wanted it, they'd be buying it, like, and money would be coming in. But it doesn't seem that it is.
No, and that's the thing. Like it's because often when you make this case, they're like, "Oh, look at it, look at what it can do." Like that's fine, but it's the return on investment. If you want a capitalist model towards making this technology happen, you just don't have the fundamentals there. Like, and it's especially interesting that, for example, Mistral and actually also DeepSeek, of course, being cheaper to have created, but it's focused on the Mistral case as the French open source one, that have taken a lot less cash from investors than others have, and have been criticized for that as that sort of showing a lack of ambition and the usual sort of Europeans falling behind. But they might be the one then later on with a sort of credible business model, if you will, because just still, I mean, their valuation is also high, but at least they've not sunk in tens of billions into something. They won't be able to recoup that. And I think, I mean, there is something bigger around that. It's not just the AI thing, right? There's the whole venture capital system that's effectively a Ponzi scheme often, I think, in the sense of like it always relies on a lot of these. It's not necessarily new that there is not a very clear actual profit model. It is you pump so much money in that you can undercut whatever system was in place before, and then you destroy the rest of the market, and then you are the market, and that's when it starts to make money. It's a bit more nuanced than that, but like a lot of them have relied on that sort of model for quite a long time, and we're seeing it again just with more money.
I remember seeing it with NFTs a few years ago. Someone I worked with, said in the office that they just bought some NFTs. So I said, why? And they're like, well, because in the metaverse, I can like put the NFTs on my wall in my sort of metaverse house. And I was like, what are you talking about? What? And then there's the old story about I don't know if usually it's attributed to Henry Ford, but I think it's apocryphal, about the guy who shined his shoes talking to him about stocks. ahead of the 29 crash. I remember my mum, who barely knows how to use an iPhone, talking to me about whether she should set up an NFT, and so that brought home to me that Henry Ford anecdote of like, oh yeah, this seems a bit of a Ponzi scheme as well.
That's the cruelty of the situation.
To change track slightly, I always feel like Putin is a master of sleights of hand. He's very good at making people believe he's much stronger and more cunning than he really is. And I feel like that those sleights of hand are sort of born out of Russia's extreme weakness vis-a-vis the West. And then what I always think is hilarious about Putin and Russia is that these sleights of hands are so successful in scaring the West that they prompt Western leaders to make themselves even more powerful than Russia. So I've been wondering if, with this rush of like Europe using its vast resources to create a rearmament bank, build out an industrial capacity for producing weapons, scaling up its military capabilities, if Russia's doing that again.
That's an interesting point, I think. And a good parallel, perhaps, a bit what Trump is doing from the other side, if you will. There's like strange pathologies a little bit, like underpinning a lot of what Putin has been doing, right? And even the very act of invading Ukraine is arguably an irrational one, even if it now looks like for some people, like say maybe if the Trump gamble works out, then it might all seem like some sort of strategic masterstroke. Still don't think that it is, and it was never intended to be like this. I think Putin is a gambler and Putin is a tactician, so he responds to the conditions ahead of them, and there he manages to often wiggle himself into something that, well, can look quite good for Russia. And I think he's helped there indeed by this sort of sometimes quite irrational fear of Russia, a very large nuclear arsenal. As well as maybe that sort of unwillingness in the West writ large to sort of see Russia for what it is, or always harbor this strange hope that you could reform Russia, or reform Putin rather. Like I do think I have some hope you could reform Russia. I don't think that that's a lost cause, difficult as that might be.
I can fix him.
Yes, exactly. Like maybe I'm being naive there as well, but I don't think like there is some sort of something innate in the Russian soul in the same way there was nothing innate in the German soul to always put them on this path that whatever happens, we always end up here. Like I don't believe in that. I don't think it's productive to think like that. I do think it's very difficult to get Russia to be, if you look where they are right now, to be something else that it is, and that's. At least I feel that in Europe, most countries have now finally kind of let that idea go. At least for the foreseeable future, you cannot reform this Putin government, at least there's some sort of derivative version of it that might follow next. I do think, indeed, like if Europe somehow manages to emerge out of this moment much geopolitically stronger, both kind of militarily and more generally as a sort of more, let's say, credible geopolitical actor that can chart its own course independently from the US and take a different path, that's certainly then not in Putin's interest, and that's kind of like backfired exactly what he wanted. What's very interesting to me in this moment actually is this moment of retreat from the US. As you mentioned before, there is no reason why Ukraine has to go for this. There's no reason why Europe has to go for this. That's another emperor has no clothes moment. I feel like a little bit indeed. But leverage is there for why would Zelensky say yes to this, right? If that's a moment that leaves a vacuum for maybe Europe to come up with a credible alternative in this situation, and if Europe managed to do this on its own, that would be this massive sort of Hamiltonian moment, I think, for Europe. If there's some sort of way that Europe can find its voice in this and push this in a more positive direction and kind of help Ukraine, that would be a massive moment, I think, and that must surely be completely adverse to anything that Putin would have wanted when he started out with this.
As you've alluded to, you are working on a book about subsea cables, and there's been a whole recent controversy over what is happening in the Baltic with the cutting of subsea cables. And I remember seeing on one of the few times I dipped into Blue Sky, I remember seeing a back and forth between Tumas Ilves, the former Estonian president, and Shashank Yoshi, the Economist defense correspondent.
Yeah.
Where I think there was the suggestions that, I don't know if Finland believed that it was just an accident, the cutting of these cables, and sort of Tomas was sort of rubbishing that, and they were having a back and forth. So I wondered if you could give an overview of what was happening and also what you think is happening.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there've been 4 now, really. So that's quite a lot. That's really outside of the norm, kind of bigger incidents with ships, with Russia ties, China ties, cutting cables in the Baltic Sea, basically, and often quite many at the same time. Started in 2023. There's now been a couple. And what's interesting about these incidents, so they all happened with commercial ships often. Some of them sort of part of the Russian Shadow Fleet. All 4 of these ships basically left from a Russian port, dragged their anchors, so a ship and they stop. They dragged their anchors over the seabed and then cut several both communications cables, power cables at the same time, which is mostly an annoyance. These are all cables then owned by countries bordering the Baltic. So it's like Finland's been impacted by this, Lithuania, Germany, Denmark, etc. This sort of ongoing thing. The tricky bit about a lot of these incidents is that it's quite hard to prove intent in this, because it's a commercial ship basically pretending to do something stupid. This does happen occasionally, like a cable can actually break when maybe often like fishing ships or slightly less well-trained crews maybe drag their anchor over it, that sort of thing. And where this controversy you've been referring to was about is that a lot of European countries now, and the kind of countries impacted by this, do now believe that these are deliberate actions by Russia, kind of the typical sort of gray zone tactics, a lot of plausible deniability here, right? Because it's very hard to prove they intended to do it. And then there was quite interesting reporting in the, I believe it was in the Washington Post a couple of weeks ago, that suggested that there was this sort of emerging consensus between Western countries that actually all of these incidents were not cases of sort of Russia orchestrating things in the back, but in fact accidental and not such well-trained crews, etc., etc. And I think quite many people jumped on that. Like I sit a bit on the fence. I think the number, like the pattern here, the nature of these incidents, very like crude force and the sort of number of them in quite quick succession really suggests that there's something going on. And I think that consensus has now shifted. You could make a case that these were incidents, but it's surely not the case that we're now in a situation where that there is a consensus between countries that these were accidents. And that Washington Post reporting turned out to probably be very heavily informed by American intelligence assessments, basically. And the Americans have been quite skeptical in general about a lot of this conning and sabotage, etc. And I mean, in the absence of any quite convincing proof that they've handed over by that's quite a strange position. And I would agree with kind of Finnish policymakers that at the very least, you might not be able to definitively prove that this was sabotage, but at the very least, it's very suspicious, and you can't just write this off as just incidents in a sort of normal pattern. There's a bigger question there, and that's also going to be interesting if you're moving in this moment of sort of decoupling between Europe and the US. Is that a lot of caution about these sort of hybrid incidents in Europe more generally, because it's not just been these cables in the Baltic, but also things like kind of factory fires and ammunitions, factories, all of these things. It's just a lot of stuff that there's been a bit, particularly coming from the Biden administration, push to sort of keep that, they don't make too much noise about that and kind of keep it down and prevent escalation with Russia.
I mean, there was also there was also the weird thing about the trains being set on fire in France.
Right, yeah, it is all these sort of things, and then it's like some of it gets like, it turns out, was it like environmental activists, or was it sort of but are they being paid by Moscow? These sort of things. There's a lot of nebulous stuff going on. There's kind of domestic cables during the Olympics cut in France. Indeed, like they kind of crippled the kind of public transport during the Olympics. These sort of things. There's just a lot of it all over Europe. A quite big uptick just generally in power cuts. Not all of them attributed. I mean, even the assassination attempt, I think, or the foiled assassination attempt of the CEO of Rheinmetall, all of that kind of belongs in the same bucket. And it's basically either Russia doing it directly, Russia paying agitators, but Russia encouraging people to do it. We don't know, not all of this, right? But some of this for sure. It's basically low threshold warfare, effectively trying to undermine Europe. But there's been a bit some hesitance about calling it out. About both kind of among European leaders. It's changed a bit now in recent months. Also definitely by the US previously. But I've heard from policymakers like a bit more in the know about this, that part of that is strategy. Of course, you just don't want to cause panic. That's a choice. I think you can debate that. There's also maybe something about the inclination, perhaps in intelligence communities, to not be too vocal about stuff. Like they're not necessarily in a habit to attribute stuff so publicly. So it's also just a mindset shift that even though it might well be very well recognized within, say, intelligence communities and kind of military security establishments, that all of this is happening and maybe action is being taken. We don't know that either. Maybe things are happening in Russia as well that we don't hear about, maybe. But that it's not per se in their habit to go out and say this was a deliberate act. But now you really do see that change. Recently, Healy, defense minister in the UK, calling out suspicious behavior by Russian ships in British waters, these sort of things, which is good, I think. I think you need to be more vocal about this and not just let it happen.
Katja, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
I just want to thank Katja again for sparing the time. If you enjoyed our conversation, please like, rate, and comment. If you want to follow us on social media, the links are in the show notes. I hope you all tune in again next week.